Thank you so much for joining us. So this event this evening is co-hosted by two organizations. I'm David Olson with Retro Report. I'll have Eliza introduce herself in a moment to us, who's joining us from the Foreign Policy Association. We have an amazing guest speaker who's joining us this evening as well. The other thing I'll say is you can grab this whole slide deck now, or you can wait. I will be following up this evening after we're done here with an email with links to all of the resources that we've shared, including the entire slide deck as well. We're an open book here. We love to share resources and share all of the things that we think might be helpful to you in your classroom. So with that, again, my name is David Olson. I'm the Director of Education at Retro Report. Really happy to connect with all of you this evening. I'm joined by the very talented Eliza McClelland. Eliza, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Eliza McClelland, and I run the educational outreach for the Foreign Policy Association. So for those of you who don't know us, we were formed in 1918, so we're over 100 years old. And our mission is to be a catalyst for developing opinions and awareness and understanding of all things foreign policy and global issues in general. So our mission is to help you teach the next generation about all things foreign policy. So this felt like a really natural connection between David and I with our two organizations to really share from a multimedia aspect to bring to you the articles we produce, the videos Retro Report produces, and our wonderful esteemed speaker, Professor Carolyn Kissane, who's also the Dean of the graduate programs at the Global Affairs department at NYU. Did I get that right, Carolyn?
It's good. The Center for Global Affairs, yes.
Center for Global Affairs, thank you. She's also a preeminent scholar on all things energy, the geopolitics of energy, politics in general, of how energy transfers and migration and issues from energy and climate change. So she seemed like the perfect person to help you bring this to your classrooms. And I'll share some of the materials that we produce in order to help make this more accessible to your students and your communities.
Wonderful. And so tonight, over the course of the next about 55 minutes here, our goal is to talk through some different approaches for teaching about climate change, for teaching about global policy, really the resources that we're going to share over this evening and some of the learning we're going to experience here with Dr. Kissane is going to really cross a number of different disciplines, from things like environmental science to geography, to civics and government, to history, plenty of places. Fortunately or unfortunately, this is one of those topics that really cuts across all sorts of, different disciplines and different lines. So what we're going to be sharing, we hope, will be applicable to you no matter what you are teaching. So if you're an English teacher, welcome. We have stuff for you, and this will fit in perfectly. And specifically, we're going to dive in when Eliza and I share some of our resources, to check out some of these resources that look at environmental issues both from a historical context, but also from a contemporary policy context. So I know Dr. Kissane, who's going to speak here in a moment and sort of start us off, is going to be able to give us some of that context of, what are some of the challenges that we're facing right now. With a little bit of background, because I know we try to cast a wide net in telling people about this event this evening. Some of you may come here not knowing either of the partner organizations. Maybe you came to us through one of the organizations. So just a little bit of background. If you're unfamiliar with Retro Report, we are a nonprofit news organization. Essentially, we spend our time, energy, and resources trying to tell stories and focusing on short form documentary films, really with the goal of trying to connect past and present, to follow up on stories from history and explain how they're still relevant to us, or to look at things happening in the world today and ask, what's the backstory that we need to know to be able to understand the moment that we're living through? So all told, over the last decade, we've put together an amazing collection of films, nearing 300 films now, all of which are entirely free on our website. And then over the past several years, we really have been focusing on connecting with educators and creating resources for secondary and even post-secondary classrooms to help teachers who are teaching social studies, English, science, all sorts of different things. So regardless of what subject you teach, I can guarantee that if you come back to Retro Report, you can find more materials for either other classes or other units or topics that you're going over. So we would love to have you connect with us and find some resources that you can put to use. Eliza, why don't you tell us a little bit about the Foreign Policy Association as I navigate to your website here?
Absolutely. So our mission is to help people understand foreign policy, which can be a very dense subject. So David has just taken us to the page which has our high school resources, which is articles that we produce on about a monthly basis. And I'll walk you through one of them, but this is the landing page for it. If you don't know how to find
Here,
it, it's
actually,
through that.
we'll get you
Yeah,
here.
it's a
So this
little
is
bit.
fpa.org. If you scroll down a little bit, right here.
The scholars link is where you'll find all of our articles. And then honestly, I feel like most of our articles, we try and make sure that they are evergreen and that they are pertinent. New things happen, things change. So we are going to continue to cover climate change at least once a year because we just think it's such an important topic and it continues to change and morph. But all of our materials are really look at things from a historical perspective. We try and have multimedia. We've integrated some Retro Report video content into our materials, as well as we have some old ones. We had a TV show called Great Decisions that aired on PBS that may come back again one day. But we try and really make it a very approachable content. Again, just like Retro Report, all of our material is completely free and accessible. And as an educator, I thought it was really important not just to have the information, but to figure out how to use it in the classroom. So I'm going to pull up Professor Kassane's article, which is the one titled Climate Migration, issue 14. So when you click on that, you're taken to an integrated PDF. All your students can click on it as well. And all of our articles follow a similar format. So every single one has 3 debates included in it that you can use in your classroom. And we try and make them as pertinent as we can to a high school audience that ranges with the topic. Certainly the first year of Biden was not quite as easy to make pertinent to 17-year-olds. But we still try and do it and we still try and figure it out. They all have a lot of images that try and make it accessible as well. And then our entire back page is really for educators. So we have a vocab bank. This is it. It has, every single one has a political cartoon with questions to explore it deeper and think more deeply about it. And then now it's your turn to make great decisions, which is your chance to use it as both creative writing, personal writing, which is always your story, and also essays to kind of assess their understanding. And then on the right, there's ways to kind of engage with more of our content. So that's kind of what all of these articles will look like. I will send out an email after this tomorrow or on Monday, telling you a little bit more about this and where to find it. But I will also tell you that we will put you on our mailing list, which I promise does not inundate you. I've been on that side of it and I don't want that either. So you get about 1 email a month from us with this content. And then we try and integrate anything else. So we told in our last one, everyone about this webinar. We have coming up our Teacher Training Institute, which is a 5-day institute we run every June, diving into really all of the topics we've covered throughout the year. With preeminent scholars, with interesting professors and journalists and political decision makers. And then also it's a really fun event where we try and honor the teachers and the work you've put in throughout the year. So We often go to Broadway shows and we take you out and wine and dine you and try and make it a really special event. It's hosted in New York City. We pay for room and board and travel expenses to a certain degree. So hopefully for next year, some of you will consider applying for it. But that's kind of an overview of what FPA does. If you are in the New York tri-state area, we also have a ton of in-person events that we always love to have educators come into. So if you're interested, reach out, and I will put you in touch with our events team, some of which I think are on this call.
Excellent. We'll move now. I'll introduce here. Actually, Eliza, you know Dr. Kissane much better because I know she's been a guest at your summer institute. Obviously, wrote what we just checked out there. But yes, we're really happy to have Dr. Carolyn Kissane, who's the associate dean and also professor of global affairs and global security at NYU. And I will say, when we initially planned this and started advertising, I know Eliza was working on securing you, Dr. Kissane, and getting you to speak. But since we were able to publicize, like, hey, here's who's going to be our speaker, I've actually received a couple different emails from educators to say, oh, I've seen her speak before. She's amazing. So no pressure at all. But you know, word on the street is that you're wonderful at what you do. So I will stop sharing my screen. And we should, let me make sure, you should now, Dr. Kissane, be able to share yours. So take it away.
Well, excellent. Well, David, thank you so very much for that very generous introduction. And Eliza, it's lovely to see you. And I just want to tell everyone who, if you have not participated in the Teacher Institute, you must. It's really quite an extraordinary experience. I've had the real privilege to be able to speak at the Teacher Institute, and the educators in the room are inspiring. They ask great questions. I love what FPA does. I've been kind of involved since 2006. So, but that's just to as a testament to how impressed I am with the organization and their commitment to working with educators. So it's a real, as I said, it's an honor and a privilege also to have the opportunity to speak to you all tonight. So thank you. Thank you to Retro Report and to the FPA, great decisions. Yeah, so I am really, this isn't a topic, climate, energy, these are things that I teach at NYU. I work with specifically with graduate students, but I'm also part of the NYU Climate Initiative, which is actually interesting because when David was sort of going around and talking about some of the subjects that you teach, this is the conversation that we're having at NYU is how do we bring in faculty from the humanities? How do we bring in faculty from engineering, faculty from the arts? I do global affairs, global security, really sort of thinking about it across the curriculum in terms of ways that we already are teaching about, but ways that we can expand our teaching on climate. And you know what? I'll be honest with you, NYU is really recognizes that they need to respond to student interest and demand, right? NYU now actually it's ranked. You have green college and university rankings as to how they rank on sustainability. And the reason why NYU puts, resources towards that is because rankings are very important, and they see that the younger generation and generations to come really care about sort of seeing how the university commits itself and what it does with regards to action on climate, action on sustainability. So I commend you all for taking the time tonight to come and hear about the way that some of the things that I'm thinking about, I'm teaching. I do have to say, so last night, which is really interesting, I'm doing this tonight. Last night, I hosted a very big event at NYU on global elections, energy, and climate. And I had someone who is the editor of climate and energy at The Economist, as well as someone who's at Wood Mac, who also is the podcast host of The Energy Gang. I can put some of those links in for those of you that want to sort of follow some of that work. But the elections, 2024 elections global, are a really good entry point for students because it's a historic year. You have, I think, 65 countries that are going to the polls. It's a record year. We've never seen a year like this. So 49% of the world's population is voting in elections. So in May, it's India. We have Mexico going to the polls in June, of course, the United States in November. But energy and climate are issues that are, for in many countries, are kind of on the ballot in different ways. So just to kind of put it out there as a point of entry for getting your students interested, because again, they're not yet in a position to vote, but their voice really does matter. And so, kind of giving them that sense of understanding what are some of the issues that the United States is confronting and thinking about, but also these are not just issues for the United States, these are global issues, right? So it's a kind of an interesting, and some of you may actually have, if you have seniors who are already 18 who are in a position to vote, and yes, the civics aspect, 100%. There's just a lot here to kind of think about climate in a very interdisciplinary way, which is kind of some of the language that we're using at NYU to sort of think about it across disciplines, across departments, across schools, from the School of Medicine to the School of Global Public Health, to the College of Arts and Sciences, like across the School of Engineering, School of Nursing. Like we have people who are teaching issues of climate across the whole entire university right now, which is not something that I saw 20 years ago when I came to NYU. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes, but then I really do welcome your questions and comments and, how I can help you, or you can tell me what you're hearing from students, which would be great. Because this is really, as I said, it's a very large, complex topic to take on, but I think and I tried to, when I put the slides together, so you'll probably see there's a couple of places where it's like not all connected, but it's kind of intentional because of ways that you can kind of come in to teach about it, from the point of climate migration, which is a piece that I did do for Great Decisions, but also sort of understanding some of the science of climate change, understanding some of the, so the international relations of energy and climate. So, hopefully you can also sort of use the slides as a resource and sort of say, okay, that's an interesting place where we could really engage our students. So yeah, I'll get started here, and let me go here. Hold on a second. Let me go here and go to my. So one thing that's really interesting is just the fact a lot of this is so in the news today, right? So you can absolutely look at it historically and look at sort of changes, and the UN and the IPCC reports are sort of great resources for that, to kind of look at the historical side of it. But then there's just the day-to-day realities. And I'll just share a very quick anecdote. So the past 2 summers, I've worked with high school students looking at carbon capture. So it's kind of an interesting topic. And one of the things that the high school students who participate in the summer program told me is they're doing this for 6 weeks over the summer, working with Air Company here in New York as air scholars, is because they want to experience winter again. So they recognize that they haven't had a big winter here in New York. So I know we have educators from many different places, but one said, I only had an inch of the winter 22-23, and they were really like heartbroken to feel that they're missing something. They're missing the experience of winter. So it's just, again, sort of thinking about all of you in the very diverse classrooms that you have. And I think there are just so many interesting ways to kind of like capture your students' interest. So this is, this is from the New York Times. I'm sorry, some of Reuters and the New York Times. But like the last 8 years were the hottest years on record. 2023 was hotter than 2022, and 2024 is expected to be hotter than 2023. And how that's experienced around the world, of course, is very different. And so, here you have, in terms of looking at from 1880 through the early 2020s, and you sort of see this temperature increase. But then the question is, like, how does it impact people? And, here in the United States, again, depending on the state you're in, you can probably recall over the last few summers, the extreme heat days and what that meant. I remember in the June of 2022, getting calls from colleagues and people that I know in Canada, on the west coast of Canada, where they were declaring heat days, where students could not go to school because it was so hot. And this is a region that just historically, on average, does not have that extreme heat. This was 110, 115-degree days. We think about snow days, which were maybe in some places we're not experiencing too many of them, but heat days and what that means for on so many different levels around health, around, economic indicators associated with loss of productivity because of heat days. And another really interesting point of entry, I think, for students is air conditioners. Because air conditioners, right, we kind of take it for granted, and I do in many cases, that we kind of, we'll go when it's really hot, we have a place that we can escape to. We have an air-conditioned space that we can escape to. That's not the case in many different parts of the world. However, in many different parts of the world that historically did not use air conditioners, so if anyone here traveled to Europe 15 years ago, or maybe even 10 years ago, many places did not have air conditioners. And now today, if you go to Spain, you go to Italy, you go to France, Paris Olympics that are coming up this summer, believe me, there's a lot of air conditioning that's being installed in order to sort of be prepared for heat and be prepared for providing comfort. So it's very interesting to sort of see how these sort of changes in temperature are also impacting sort of choices that people make and have to make, and governments also have to make. So I did write the piece on climate migration. And again, here we are. I'm not going to make any assumptions about everyone in the room, but it is fair to say that when we're looking at the upcoming election in November, that, migration is on the ballot, right? That we're looking at, as a very significant issue in the upcoming election. And so, but what we're seeing around the world and what we expect to see a lot more of is, in fact, migration that's in part triggered by climate change. And climate change, again, that has very variable impacts depending on where in the world you are. So in some parts of the world, Africa, some parts of Latin America, some parts of Asia, it is quite extreme in terms of droughts, in terms of really significant shifts in agricultural production, which is again directly linked to livelihoods, that, forcing families or members, single members of families to migrate. And where are they migrating to? They're, of course, migrating to places where there are opportunities or chances for employment. So it's it's an issue today, but it's not an issue that's going to go away. And the one thing I would say to David and Eliza, there's a great in 2020, the New York Times and Pulitzer did a piece for the New York Times on climate migration, which I reference in my piece. But the visuals are really fantastic, and especially given today's contention in the United States over migration, this is very specific to Central America. And again, sort of seeing how changes in precipitation and different things are a trigger to migration and forced migration in some places. So again, the great displacer, so we're understanding how in the context of a changing climate, which then leads to changes in precipitation, which then leads to changes in agricultural production, which then leads to changes in health and so many other things. And sort of now playing it out that I'll get to the bad news a little bit later in the slides, but this is not something that's going to go away. There's no magic wand here to make this go away. So kind of understanding that is a really interesting place to bring your students in to kind of understand migration. There's a whole international law issues. Most countries do not recognize climate as a point of status for a refugee. So again, just sort of looking at the scale in terms of, again, also understanding, what is causing displacement, right? Displacement is, there can be political, in the last decade, Venezuela, for example, you've had probably close to 6 million people have left Venezuela. And part of that is due to political repression and violence. And some of it is also dramatic displacement with regards to livelihood and climate. But you see here, if you just look, extreme temperatures, landslides, wildfires, droughts, cyclones, hurricanes, typhoons, kind of just understanding some of the different things that are sort of pushing the scale of movement to new levels that we haven't seen before. So again, I think this is important to kind of recognize. And I'll just say one thing, because this was in January, I had the opportunity to be I'm a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, and David Miliband, who leads the International Rescue Committee, was on a panel, but they were talking about preventive priorities for the United States. And this report every year comes out, and they look at national security threats to the United States. And one national security threat to the United States is, in fact, migration, right? It's sort of recognized as a big issue confronting the United States. David, who represents the largest international rescue, committee that deals and addresses migration, says, but the national security threats from what will be, right, from countries in Africa that are experiencing very significant displacement today that, potentially could be very big threats in the future for various different reasons. So again, lots of really fascinating, rich materials here to consider for your students. And I just, sorry. And this is, again, climate vulnerability. And very interesting. Like if you get into climate finance, it's really, again, if your students are kind of curious, well, how do we fund this? What do we do if we're thinking about? And so one of the things that's challenging is that the countries that are the most vulnerable, the most vulnerable, are the countries that are probably the least likely to get any kind of funding. And part of that is because they are so fragile politically, and because oftentimes they are places where there are regional conflicts that are going on. So the most climate vulnerable are also probably the least likely to get any kind of assistance, whether it be from the United States or even from the European Union or Japan. So it's the least climate vulnerable, those that kind of have the funding to also adapt to address mitigation, are also very careful in terms of where funding goes. So lots of really interesting things here. This is from the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. And again, I added this as a little complex, and I only added it to sort of think about actors. So in international relations, sometimes you think about actors and who are the actors. So you can think about, governments, you can think about companies, how are companies responding, investment, where money goes, and then of course, individuals, right? I saw that, in terms of the civic side of addressing climate change. So sort of think about points that you can bring into your classrooms that are of interest to students, because there's a role for each of these different types of actors when thinking about climate. And they're somewhat different, but they also, if you go to the UN and you look at the Sustainable Development Goals, number 17 is partnerships, right? Which is very much sort of suggesting that this is about governments, companies, and individuals, civil society organizations, kind of really working much more closely together to address sustainability, to address the global issues that we are confronting. And this is an interesting thing, because I hear this from people. I actually hear this a lot from colleagues I have at the NYU Stern School of Business, and this may apply to your students, right? Is that, things that they're thinking about, jobs that they're thinking about, what they want to study in college, right? What they want to do, is that they are thinking about sustainability in some way. They're thinking about purpose, right? They're thinking about, if I don't like the way the world looks now, what can I do to change it? So again, as a point of entry, you can also sort of be seeing, again, I have a great slide that looks at climate tech, because that's a fascinating, area to sort of think about, where students can get themselves involved. But this, like friends of mine who do sustainability, they're like, this is big. The students in their classrooms, undergraduate, graduates, they want to know what companies are doing, what governments are doing. I'm going to go because I want to be mindful of time. But also for the election, we've seen really interesting shifts, that it's not so much of a partisan issue that it once was framed as, that, we've seen that, more Americans, whether they identify as Republicans or as Democrats, sort of are recognizing climate. And we have a sort of a shift in some of those views, which again is really important, right? When you sort of look across the country. And a very interesting thing that came out last night is that what would be identified as red states in the electoral map are the states where actually in the United States where you have the most renewable energy. Right. And so the Inflation Reduction Act, which the Biden administration passed in 2022, red states have actually been the biggest beneficiaries of the Inflation Reduction Act. So if you look at Texas is my case. If you want to take your students into the most fascinating state in the United States for studying energy, go to Texas. Just take them through like a tour of energy in Texas, because Texas does everything. They do oil, they do natural gas, they do geothermal, they are number one for wind power in the United States, solar. They kind of like are doing it all. And so they're a little bit agnostic about what types of energy that the state of Texas produces, because they sort of see it as like, okay, if we can do it here, let's do it. And if there are economic benefits back to Texans and to, that's why a lot of people are moving to Texas, right? So it's really interesting to sort of look at some of those issues. This is where I get into a little bit of geopolitics. There's a lot here, but China and the United States, again, which will be a big issue in the upcoming, already is. Some argue that cooperation is required. So the former sort of climate czar for the United States, John Kerry, that was his big thing. We need to cooperate. It's not happening. It probably won't happen, at least in the coming months leading up to the election. But kind of understanding that is really interesting. And this is a little bit of, kind of me going into the weeds, but very interesting for those of you that maybe do the sciences and you kind of want your students to kind of understand minerals and metals from a geopolitical perspective. Like I was on a call this morning with people from the US State Department, from the Colorado School of Mines, from the Canadian government. Like, this is a big issue in terms of when you think about electric vehicles, batteries, so many things require inputs that are mined inputs. And so which countries are mining and which countries are processing. So again, very interesting to sort of look at. It's a very, not every country mines critical minerals and metals. Not every country wants to or can process. So, kind of interesting. There's a very interesting sort of geopolitics of energy, international relations, those of even government policy, that is very interesting to look at. I'm getting to the end. This is just, again, David and Eliza can share the slides. My very simple is that 1.5 is done. We should probably put it to rest and accept probably 2 degrees. Right? May not go above 2, but we can expect 1.5 is already pretty much kind of we're racing past it. So there's a whole interesting set of questions to ask your students about that as well, in my opinion. So world regions very different in terms of where CO2 emissions come from. The United States and China are the largest emitters of carbon emissions. China. So we're the largest producer of oil and natural gas, the United States. We produce 13 million barrels of oil a day, a lot of natural gas. We're the largest exporter of liquefied natural gas, which helped Europe when the war in Russia's war against Ukraine started. But China is the largest manufacturer of electric vehicles, of batteries, of solar, and of wind. So it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition to sort of play with for your students. Climate tech, really interesting. Where in the world is climate tech happening? There's a lot of different interesting sort of regions where you see a lot of climate tech investments. And again, very interesting for getting your students kind of excited. This is an exciting entry point. This is where it's about possibility. This is where it's about, okay, we don't have to accept that things are going to continually get worse. This is like, what is, agency around new technologies that are emerging, that are changing the landscape. I did an event a couple of weeks ago with the head of innovation at University of California, San Diego. And he said, listen, 5 years ago, he was more pessimistic than he is today. And he said the reason why he's less pessimistic is because of the extraordinary array of new technologies that are sort of on the horizon and have emerged. So Yes. So I covered hopefully, but I want to make sure that there's time for questions. I'm really happy to take any questions you have. I know we did climate migration. We did a little bit of like energy security and geopolitics. But I'm happy to kind of take you through any sort of specific questions that you have.
Excellent. I think we'll keep monitoring the chat if people put some questions there. I mean, I know I have a million questions. I think one of the things I really appreciated about that, Dr. Kissane, is that I think, and maybe this is true for, middle and high school students, but I think when we think of climate migration, the easy thing to think of is like, oh, there's a terrible storm or terrible weather issue that was made worse by climate change, terrible floods that have forced people to move. Where really there are so many impacts that it can be difficult sometimes to directly trace something to a climate issue. But I think the article that you've written, some of the resources and wonderful graphics that you shared there shows this isn't just let's wait for the wildfires to get worse and force people to move. It's what are those other ways where changes in climate have a political, social, and economic impact on different parts of the globe and affect them in different ways, right? That effect is not equally spread around the globe. So not sure there was a question in there, but thank you. I thought you did a great job of explaining, some of the nuance to that issue.
Well, there's a lot of nuance, and I saw some great comments in the chat around teaching about the Arctic, which is fascinating. Again, very interesting around like heat days, air quality. Yeah, I mean, these are all, conflict. And yes, so climate is part of a set of variables in terms of that correlate with conflict. It's always difficult to say direct causation because there are other things that are going on, but absolutely. And you're seeing in some of the places, for example, in Africa, where you do have, you know, significant drought, changes of precipitation, where you are seeing, and also sometimes competition for very limited resources. And one of those big resources, of course, is water. So I didn't even touch upon water, but that's water as a driver of conflict, right? We used to, when I was in graduate school, the conversation was around, the next war will be over oil. Nope. Water conflict is much more likely in terms of even small scale regional conflicts over water. And you have it even transboundary water issues, which again, a really interesting sort of place for students to kind of look at. Even here, if you're teaching in the Colorado River Basin region, that's a case study, right? For kind of understanding what were agreements that were made at a time when climate was never considered that there would be a change, and that not only would you have a lot of migration to the states around using the Colorado River, but that there would be such, then you would also see changes in water levels. And so it's a totally different environment today in 2024 than it was when some of these agreements were made between states. So you've got a very interesting, those of you that teach government here in the United States, federal government versus state governments and how state governments respond. And this idea of, when will the federal government have to say, no, it's not about, we have to, federal government regulation policy here is going to trump states because of, some really dramatic changes.
Absolutely. Dr. Kissane, I'm going to give you a chance to look at some of the questions that have come up in the chat. We'll circle back to those. I'm going to share some resources here briefly from Retroport, watch a couple film clips as we examine this, and we'll circle back and try to make sure we get everyone's questions answered. But I'll give you a chance to check those out. One of the things I really like that that Dr. Kassane brought up at the end of her presentation was about, what are some of the areas for potential? What are some of the possible success stories? And that leads me here, my transition to this first Retro Report resource, which I think does do a good job of addressing a success story. Arguably, there are not as many as we would like there to be, but our ability to have address the issue with the ozone layer and make global policy changes, I think are a great model for what's possible with other climate related issues. So here, this is a film that we released a few months ago. I'm a big fan, especially as a child growing up in the 80s and 90s, where we were bombarded with learning about the hole in the ozone layer and the problems that it was going to cause. So I'll show you just a short clip of this film here.
Today, scientists who recently returned from the Antarctic told Congress that the ozone layer still is disappearing at an alarming rate.
The sledgehammer that actually dealt that blow had to be the chlorofluorocarbons, because the chlorine in our atmosphere in general is something like 80% man-made.
By the mid-1980s, the U.S. had a partial ban on CFCs and aerosols, and calls for more bans and international action were growing during President Reagan's administration.
It was the Secretary of the Interior, Don Hodel, who I think, as a result of pressures from some countries that did not want to move forward with a treaty on ozone depletion, we were actually asked to develop a cost analysis for everyone to wear hats and sunglasses when they went outside, rather than stop producing the chemicals that destroyed the ozone layer. We had to actually look at the number of people in the United States, multiply it by 237 million to come up with a cost estimate.
How are you feeling, sir? How serious is your nose?
President Reagan had skin cancer on his nose, and so apparently that captured his imagination, and he agreed that we could go forward and negotiate a solution to the problem.
The industry decided they were losing this fight. And as one of their lobbyists told me, it's better to be at the table than on the menu.
In 1987, with the scientific evidence growing on the dangers of CFCs to the ozone, a UN summit in Montreal brought global leaders, scientists, and industry representatives together to address the issue.
I thought Montreal was very hard because it isn't easy to get your own government in the right place or the 180 odd countries to agree to something. It's basically almost unwieldy when you think of that many countries with that many issues. And it took all of us to actually get the job done.
All right. So again, the rest of this film tells the story of how these negotiations in Montreal, organized by the UN, ultimately were successful. Some of the things they try to do different to meet the needs of both developed countries and developing countries, and make this a success story. It's a really, really excellent film. And here, if you come to the Retro Report Film Library, this is where you can find all of our films, about 300 or so, and scroll through, find all sorts of things. This one here, Healing the Ozone, First Steps Towards Success. If we come to the video page here, what you'll notice as we scroll down, there's a short write-up. I do want to point out, especially if you're not familiar with Retro Report, I did have the captions on as I showed that video. For those, I know we have some folks who work with English language learners and things like that. That's a really good practice, not only for students learning English, but really as a great use of language for all students. I know if you've ever shown videos from YouTube, if you've turned on auto caption, it could be not good. It's a real hot mess often. You don't have to worry about that with Retro Report resources because we upload our own SRT files. You can also find the full transcript there as well. You can link directly to them here. For this video, we actually have 3 different lesson plans and student activities. You can find them as you scroll down a little bit further. This first one is a science-focused lesson. The second one, which I'll show you here, is one could be used in a lot of different places, including a civics or government class that looks and uses this as a cabinet simulation. So here, if we click on lesson plan, this is the teacher-facing document. So this is what will tell you, what am I going to have my students do? What are my essential questions? How long will it take? Those sorts of things. If I come back and click on the student activity, this is the student-facing document. And here we create these in Google Docs so that you can make a copy and then make whatever changes and adjustments you'd like to the lesson and activity. So here, there's a handful of questions that go with the film. And then the sort of cabinet simulation, it uses the Montreal Protocol as sort of the case study, and then has students examine something that's currently before the United Nations and looking at the issues of ocean plastics and how to solve that issue. And so here, this is designed to have students enact the roles of cabinet members and advise the president and vice president on what action they should take. What should they advocate for in this UN treaty? Should we sign on to the treaty at all? Right. So here, you can go through and take a look at this. Heard from a number of teachers who've done this in their classes, and students really, really enjoyed the opportunity and experience. So here, like I said, not only is there the cabinet simulation where students go through and analyze a proposed treaty, but we also have two other lessons. One that is more science-focused, looks specifically at chlorofluorocarbons, and another one that's civics and ELA focused, has students examine a number of different environmental issues. Here we'll go to the next film I'll show you just a quick clip of, and this one looks at the issue of nuclear power and some of the potential dangers, but also, looking at nuclear power today, is it a potential as sort of a bridge use of energy? Can it get us without, creating additional carbon footprint? Can it get us to a more renewable future?
Civil defense officials are urging you to take cover.
Please stay indoors with your windows closed.
In March of 1979, Americans awoke to a nuclear nightmare.
The potential is there for the ultimate risk of a meltdown at the 3 Mile Island Atomic Power Plant outside Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
In the worst case, a massive amount of radioactive material would be spewed into an area 5 to 10 miles in diameter and 20 miles downwind.
The president tried to quell the panic.
The president's trip here was a dramatic gesture.
Within the next few days, important decisions will be made.
But the accident had fundamentally changed the nuclear power industry.
What we have to do is to call for an end to the nuclear age in its entirety.
Today, decades after 3 Mile Island cast a shadow on America's atomic dream, could nuclear power be the answer to fighting global warming?
Well, if we don't have nuclear, it's going to be a much hotter planet.
One morning, Nuclear Regulatory Commissioner Victor Galinsky received some startling news. Mysteriously high radiation and pressure readings were coming from a new nuclear reactor at 3 Mile Island.
The technical experts tell you there's got to be something wrong with the meters.
I'll stop it there in the interest of time, just give you a little tease on that one. My guess is we might have some folks who are with us who actually remember this moment in history. Some others, may have read about it, have seen it. Certainly since this time, there have been some other nuclear accidents of note that have created headlines here. And so here, with this one, there's a brand new science-focused lesson that goes with this one. Again, examining some of those pros and cons of nuclear energy, but also, trying to figure out could expansion of nuclear energy actually help us deal with issues of climate change. It's also a wonderful one if you're a history teacher, if you're teaching, something like AP US history, right? It fits perfectly in that unit about the environment and natural resources. Yeah, so Kent raises the issue of the China syndrome. Actually, Kent, within the next 45 seconds of that Retro Report film, they were going to reference and show a quick scene from the China syndrome and talk about how popular culture played into the sort of fear that surrounded that event. So absolutely the case. Another one, brand new lesson that we have that we just published within the last couple days here, looks at this issue of the Mediterranean fruit fly and issues in California in the 1980s and into the 1990s. So all of these are part of a really excellent and robust environmental education collection that we have. So I know Carolyn referenced issues with water and issues with water through the Colorado River Basin. I encourage you to check out this film called Fighting Drought with an Ancient Practice, which looks at practices in India, but also connects it to the desert Southwest in the United States and ways that people are trying to conserve rainwater there. So if we go here to our library page, click on collection, scroll down just a little bit, you can find the environmental education collection. And here you'll find a ton of different films and associated resources. So you can learn about the ozone like we just watched. Here is the drought and rainwater piece. This one about the Exxon Valdez oil spill. We can look at meatless burgers. We can look at the roots of recycling. This one is one of my favorites about invasive species, about snakes being released in the Everglades and sort of taking over as a non-native species. So plenty of different things that you can check out in our environmental education collection. So at this point, I'm going to stop for a moment. I know we're just about out of time. I thank you for hanging with us, but I'd love to be able to have Dr. Kosane address any questions that came up. Dr. Kosane, were there ones that stuck out to you that you want to chime in on?
So many.
Yeah.
No, they were all great questions. In fact, I was just addressing the teacher who mentioned teaching the Industrial Revolution, because today we have the green, what's called the Green Industrial Revolution and industrial policy that the Biden administration has put forward partially to compete against China. So very interesting in terms of how you bring that into kind of contemporary. David, your point about Silent Spring by Rachel Carson is a great book, which was, was read by John F. Kennedy and eventually inspired the creation of the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. So, the power of writing, the power of really bringing, kind of telling the story is great. Yeah, so many of you are doing such great work. It's really inspiring to hear. And again, I work with undergrads too. I'm here at NYU. And the one thing I fear is creating an apocalyptic, doomsday is coming. So with nuclear, I'm pro-nuclear power because it is considered to be really important for addressing climate because it is a zero emitting source of baseload power. So it's really, and by the way, if you want to have a really interesting class with your students, more people have died with natural gas, oil, coal than nuclear. So it's just I tell my students it's a bad PR problem that nuclear has, and I'm not discounting some of the awful things that have happened, Chernobyl and Fukushima, but there were also other things that were going on. But for addressing climate change, nuclear energy is very important. And you can sort of see how governments, China, Saudi Arabia are saying 100%, let's go nuclear as much as they possibly can and build now. And where some countries like Germany that are saying no new nuclear. So it's also just kind of interesting to kind of get into some of these debates with your students. But I loved all the questions. I put my email in the chat. Those of you that are looking at the Arctic, again, 5 countries. It's not the global commons like Antarctica. Arctic is different, but you also for science, for, so many other things. There's so many things that we're learning. By the way, migration, here's a little really interesting point. Migration, fish migration. Who thinks about fish migration? But I've spoken to Canadian scientists who are like, wait a second, certain fish are migrating to either warmer or cooler waters. And yet there's some really interesting like sovereignty issues over where people can fish. So you have lots of different places to go with your students. And I think all of you, I love like your enthusiasm and thinking about what your students are interested in and what engages them. And I think that's always a great place to start for bringing them new subjects, and maybe climate's not a new subject, but how you can get them even more involved than they are and engaged, because there are these like really interesting points of entry. But I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all.
Excellent. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Kissane. Eliza, anything else you'd like to share before we end this evening?
No, it's been fabulous to watch the comment section. Dr. Kissane, thank you so much for being with us. It's always such a delight to hear you speak. And I want to thank all the educators as well for coming out on an evening that you should have to yourselves, and to learn more about how to engage your students and bring this material back to the classroom, and how to stay positive, which is one of the comments I saw a few times. And I think Dr. Kissane did a great view of like how we can turn this, how we can look at the next election cycle to think more positively about the change we're making, as opposed to the doom and gloom look at what has already happened and what is just passively happening to us and to our students. So I mentioned to one of the educators that writing to a local official and having your students kind of voice their views is a really powerful thing to do, letting them share their voice and their opinions, and hoping that that will kind of will change the narrative is a really wonderful opportunity. And to support your students in doing that, I think, is looking at change in the future and how they can actually be that change. So I just wanted to thank everyone on this. Thank you to Retroport and David. This was a really fun way to engage on this topic.
Yes. Thank you so much to Eliza, Dr. Kissane. Thank you for joining us. Thanks to all of you educators who came to learn.